Sometimes when things happen, those things feel like turning points, but only after they've already happened. I know that might not make sense, but there are those moments that are also absolutely sudden and sharp, and people know immediately that something in the world has shifted and it's changed, and it's changed forever. And on May 23rd of 1932, in the city of Sao Paulo, Brazil, a protest was gathering on the streets. It was fueled by frustration and uncertainty and a growing sense that something fundamental had been taken away from their people. By the end of that day, 4 young lives were lost, and a movement would be born that would push an entire nation toward a massive conflict. But to understand how this happened, you have to look at Brazil in the early 1930s. The country had undergone a major political shift just a short time before this. Getúlio Vargas had come into power after a revolution, and with that change came a new way of governing. The constitution that had once defined the limits of power was no longer in place. Instead, Brazil found itself under a provisional government, and this was one that ruled by decree rather than by any kind of established law. So, for many in Sao Paulo, this change was more than just political, it was very personal. The state had long been one of the most influential in Brazil, with strong economic power and a significant voice in national affairs. That influence was suddenly reduced. Decisions were being made without the same level of representation or any kind of input. For a population that was used to a certain degree of autonomy, this shift created a lot of resentment that wasn't going to go away quietly or suddenly or easily. And at first, that resentment kind of stayed beneath the surface. Conversations took place in homes and in business and in universities, and people debated what had been lost and what could be done about it. Over time, those conversations moved forward and outward. They became organized and visible. Well, demonstrations began to form. This was bringing together students and workers and citizens who shared in a common concern, and they wanted a return to the constitutional rule. They wanted limits placed on power once again. But they weren't free to do this because of the way that the government had changed. They could be punished for this. And so they were. And on May 23rd, one of those demonstrations took place in Sao Paulo. It was not meant to be a violent protest. It was a gathering of voices, a public expression of dissatisfaction and their demand for things to change. Among those present were these students. They were young men who believed that they were participating in something that was meaningful to them and something that could help shape the future of the next generation. Well, they stood together not as soldiers, but as basic citizens. But when large groups gather in times of tension like this, the situation can change really quickly. It can become really dangerous. The presence of government forces under this new dictatorship added a layer of volatility. Orders had been given to maintain the control without specifically telling them how, and telling them to suppress dissent. And that order can be really thin. And on that day, this didn't hold up very well. So what happened next would echo far beyond that moment. Shots were fired into the crowd, and 4 students were killed. Their names were Martins, Miragia, Draiusio, and Caramaggio. I'm sorry, I don't speak Portuguese. I'm probably butchering these names. A 5th, Alvarengo, would later die from his injuries. These people were not anonymous casualties. They were individuals that each one had a life and a family and parents, and they had a future that all of a sudden was just gone. It was gone, just like them. The shock of this event spread rapidly. News traveled throughout the city and well beyond. It was carried by the word of mouth, by newspapers, and of course, there was a growing awareness that something irreversible had taken place. The deaths were not seen as isolated events. These were seen as symbolic. This was a representation of the growing divide between the government and the people who opposed it, and mainly him, their new president. And this is where the story takes its most important turn. Those four names were brought together in a single symbol. The initials formed the acronym MMDC. It became more than a reference, it became a rallying point for people. It transformed grief into a sense of identity, and that identity into action. What began as a protest now had a unifying force that people could stand behind. And in the weeks that followed, that force grew. Sao Paulo did not just mourn these dead, it mobilized. Volunteers stepped forward, forming units and preparing for conflict. This was getting serious. The movement expanded beyond the streets and into organized resistance. The demand for the Constitution became the foundation of something larger, something that would soon be known as the Constitutionalist Revolution of Brazil. On July 9th of 1932, the uprising began in full. Sao Paulo rose against the federal government, believing that it could force change through action. There was an expectation that other powerful states would join in to support them, and they would create a broader coalition that could change Vargas and his rule. That support didn't fully materialize, and the conflict that followed would test the limits of this movement. The fight lasted for months. This was not just some brief one-off confrontation, but a sustained effort that involved thousands of volunteers and soldiers. Sao Paulo faced a federal force that held significant advantages in the numbers and resources. Despite determination and organization, this major imbalance was really difficult to overcome. And by early October, the revolution already came to an end. Sao Paulo surrendered, and the military objective of the uprising was not exactly achieved. But history rarely measures events solely by their immediate outcomes. While the revolt was defeated on the battlefield, its impact did not fully disappear. The pressure created by this movement contributed to changes that followed later on. So a new constitution was eventually enacted in 1934. It did address some of the concerns that had driven the protests in the first place. The cost of reaching that point, however, was significant. Many lives were lost, the cities were damaged, and a generation was marked by this experience. What makes this story resonate is not just the scale of the conflict, but the basic origin of it. It began with a protest. It began with voices being raised in public and them not being allowed to do so. It began with a movement where individuals chose to stand together and express what they believed was right. And the escalation that followed was not inevitable, but it became a reality when tension met force in a suppressive nation regime. The deaths of those students remain a central part of this story. They are remembered not only for the tragedy itself, but for what their loss meant and what it set into motion. Their names became a symbol that carried meaning far beyond that single day. It's a reminder that individual moments can shape collective action in ways that are not always predictable. And there's also a broader lesson in how societies respond to pressure. When systems change rapidly and without clear limits, of course, reactions can build beneath the surface. If those reactions are not addressed, they can emerge in ways that are more difficult to control. The events of May 23rd illustrate how quickly a situation can move from expression to escalation, especially when somebody else doesn't want you to have an opinion. Today, the Constitutionalist Revolution is remembered as a defining moment in the history of Sao Paulo. It's commemorated, it's studied, and it's reflected upon as an example of civic action and its consequences. It stands as a reminder that the relationship between people and power is never static, and that moments of tension can lead to outcomes that reshape the future. But now I want to hear from you in the comments. But we're only talking about history, remember, not current affairs. I am a historian, not a politician. Do you think movements like this are driven more by the moment that sparks them or by the buildup of pressure that comes long before anyone takes to the streets? And of course, as always, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page because, hey, history happens. And follow along for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. You never know what's going to happen because history happens and every subscriber helps. Thank you for watching.